Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Stan Sagner, who had a career in advertising, in television. He has an MBA, and then he dropped it all to go to culinary school. He trained as a chef, worked in Michelin-starred restaurants. Then he shifted over, became a food columnist, a restaurant critic, and now he's a consultant doing all things related to the food industry. Serves restaurants, serves consumer packaged goods companies that want to have food products. And he also works with developers that are thinking about adding a food component to their development. So everything related to food is Stan. Stan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So Stan, let's start with restaurants. So you walk into a restaurant and maybe with me, and you're noticing all sorts of things about that restaurant that I would not pick up on. What are some of the things that you're looking at, that you're noticing, that an ordinary restaurant goer is not going to pick up on?
I think that well, first of all, I come at it with a degree of compassion, where an ordinary restaurant goer may not, simply because I've been on the other side and I know how difficult it can be to juggle all the things that you're trying to juggle, particularly now in the pandemic. But I notice things like how long it takes for the front of house to engage you and to make eye contact and to read the situation of who's coming in, whether the request of the reservation is met, whether you're kept waiting or seated at the time that you had scheduled your table, and sort of the general care and feeding of the guest over the course of the meal. There's roughly speaking, tend to break things into two categories, which is one is the food experience, and we can certainly get into the weeds there, but the service experience is as if not sometimes more important than the food, and that really is the difference between a successful dining experience and one that isn't.
We were chatting before about noise levels in restaurants, and there's been some articles in this, I think maybe something in the Atlantic, and noise levels have gone up, and that's in some ways intentional. Tell me a little bit about that.
That was a technique, and I think it sort of happened naturally, and it was something that restaurateurs picked up on and have taken advantage of. Is that when the volume levels are up in a restaurant, and it depends on the type of venue, but it has two effects. One is that it creates a more of a sort of a raucous party atmosphere, and that's been tracked to lead to more alcohol consumption, which raises the average check and generates more revenue for the restaurant. So there's a direct correlation to the performance of the restaurant to noise, believe it or not. The other is that inversely it creates sort of a pressure for the meal to end. People don't want to be subjected to that indefinitely, and so tables tend to turn more frequently, and the ability to have a second or a third or a third and a half turn, depending on the restaurant and the open time and the close time and the type of meal. Again, there's the average check time compresses because of the noise level. So it's not a technique that I'm particularly a fan of, simply because it degrades the experience. And there's certain customers, particularly older customers or customers with children, who find it excruciating, and I understand why.
Yeah, I've seen some restaurants or been to some where it was to such a degree that you could not even have a conversation, like even shouting to the person next to you. It's just kind of the opposite of my style. And I'm a little bit hard of hearing, particularly when there's a lot of noise in the background. So those are particularly not fun for me. Now, I know that restaurants are the only only kind of client use. Go
Sorry to
ahead.
interrupt. I'll just tell you a quick story. When I
Yeah.
was reviewing, and I'm not going to identify the restaurant, but when I was reviewing, there was a particularly hot restaurant in Lower Manhattan that kind of took that to the extreme, and the food was terrific, but the noise was so loud. I was at a table with, I think, 6 people, that the waiter couldn't actually hear my order, so I had to text it to the waiter, essentially write it onto my phone and hold it up for them to nod because they couldn't hear me over the noise of the surrounding tables and the music that was playing.
Yeah, they've probably taken it a little bit too far.
Yeah.
Now I know
Sorry to
that
interrupt your
no,
question.
I know that restaurants aren't your only customer segment, client segment. But tell us a little bit about the types of projects that you do for restaurants or restaurateurs.
Um, I've done a variety of things, and just actually this week started with a new one. Essentially, what I try to do is refine the experience for the restaurant, on different levels to extract as much revenue and reduce the sort of the pain of getting to it as much as possible. So, one restaurant that I work with, um, we we basically were trying to get over the hurdle, and it's a pretty significant one, of the pandemic. Um, and it was a restaurant that was thriving, but all of a sudden we couldn't do indoor dining. The sort of food that we served was very labor intensive. Our specialty were tasting menus. The space was small, by design, but it during a pandemic, even when we were able to restore indoor dining, we couldn't go to full capacity, and those and many other factors had huge impact on, the ability to keep the lights on. And so, for the last year and a half, we essentially tried to, and I think succeeded in reinventing the model of that restaurant and looked at everything from the ingredients that we use to the menu that we serve, um, the staffing model. We experimented with all sorts of things like, takeout that some we had never done before, meals to go, meals to prepare at home that had been essentially prepped at the restaurant. We had a bakery component. We had um, almost like a bodega commissary component. We did special events. We did virtual events. Basically, we threw paint at the wall for a year and a half to come up with every possible way to both, keep money coming in to pay the rent and keep the staff intact, which we largely did, and at the same time maintain, the DNA of the brand, that was probably the most difficult part, because if you start to mutate too far, you don't you mean nothing to anyone at that point. And we had 9 years of, um, a very hard, fought reputation to protect, and in that case, I think we did a pretty good job, but certainly made mistakes along the way. I've just started working with a new client that is a restaurant, that is part of a museum, and um, it, it's by and large it's a good experience. The food is good, the chef is talented, the service is pretty good. So all the basic, um, features are there, but everything around it is in need of an overhaul. The physical space is uninviting. They have, a very, rudimentary form of marketing. They're not on social media. They're not on reservation platforms. Their visual presentation of their food is not very good, and so we're kind of breaking it down to its most basic parts and rebuilding it in a more appealing, contemporary, and really customer facing and engaging way. It was it is a restaurant that takes its clients or its guests for granted because they're already in the museum. And what we're trying to do is make it a more memorable experience and also appeal to people who are outside of the museum that don't have to be there, that want to be there. So it's a really fun project because I believe very much in the mission of the museum, but I also believe that this is a terrific restaurant that people need to discover.
You mentioned menus, and that might be a whole specialty consulting area in itself. But what are some of the things about restaurant menus in terms of prices, in terms of the number of items that should be on a menu, not too few, not too many, maybe? Any other kind of insights on restaurant menus that the ordinary consumer might not be aware of?
Um, that's a great question. I think that again, each case is somewhat individual, but one thing, and this is something that we do spend a lot of time on, is that when you prepare a menu and you prepare food, there's different constituencies that are simultaneously considering this food. It's the guest that's sitting at the table. It's the the food writer at the legacy publications, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and and groups like Michelin, whose reviews or press really move the dial in a very significant way. You're doing it for social media, for Instagram and the pictures that your guests are taking. You're doing it for digital media, and listicles. So you're trying to please a lot of different people at the same time. And so we try to be conscious of all those things, and and so that's sort of part of the filter. And you're also thinking about actually two other categories: is you're thinking about your peers and your competitors and what they're doing, and you're both acknowledging trends in the food world, but you also don't want to mimic what everyone else is doing because you want to have something that is competitive and individual and creative that makes your establishment worth going to. And you also have a chef who works very, very hard in most cases, or probably in every case, working 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And this is their form of creative expression. And you want to honor that and give them room to be creative because it's actually one of the few perks of that job. At the same time, you want to be conscious of um, general food trends right now. I would say that certainly in New York City and other major metropolitan areas, there's a real craving for authenticity, um, and assertive flavors. People want, particularly, I think, in part, maybe fueled by the pandemic and people's inability to travel, that food serves as a kind of a surrogate. And so, if I can't go to France or India or wherever it is, at least I want to taste it. And so they don't want muted flavors. They don't want watered down fusion. They want the real deal. So that's important. The cost of ingredients is absolutely critical. And and with sort of the now beaten to death subject of supply chain issues, some products are just unavailable or at a price point that makes them prohibitive. And so you need to factor that in. And in some cases, you still go forward with them because they're so closely identified with your brand and your ethos. And in others, you need to find substitutes. So I could go on, but there's a lot of things that are going into the thinking of a menu before it goes out there.
So it seems like you could, you have to balance all those different interests. You could optimize on, how's it going to look on Instagram, but you might be sub-optimized other places. Talk to me about staffing a little bit.
Yeah.
What's been going on in your conversations with restaurants about staffing? You sort of hear about, it's restaurants having difficulty hiring people. What have you been seeing?
Um, the dynamic has changed, and it's changed for a number of reasons. One is that there are people who have simply left the industry. That they've and in New York they've moved back home because they were stuck with high rent and working for a restaurant that, despite its best efforts, wasn't reliably open or wasn't open at all. So there's a whole talent pool that has left, hopefully not for good, but that's certainly been diminished. Um, there's a pool of people that with experience who want a different experience than they've had before, and it's a reset that is an opportunity, but also a challenge that they want to be treated better. They want some of the benefits that they see white collar workers getting in terms of, you know, certain things that white collar workers take for granted, like health insurance and time off um, and sick days um, and all sorts of other things. And they also want to work in a culture that is far more compassionate than historically restaurants have often tended to be. Not always, but they are very high pressure places where people work very hard, and the work is both mental and physical, and there's a real desire for that to be rationalized and moved into a place where that kind of work is more sustainable. And I think that that's happening. And there's certainly plenty of restaurateurs that are taking it very seriously. Some of them started before the pandemic. Some have always been doing it, and some um, have heard the call, and simply, because of competitive issues, they need to pay more. They need to treat their people better, and they're doing it. And I think that's a good thing, and I hope it continues. It makes these places better places, happier places to work. It translates into a better experience for the guests, um, and it leads to less turnover, which means that the employees that are there um, are taking pride in what they do. They feel loyal to their establishment and to their guests. So, but that does impact the check, and customers need to be aware of that they're paying more. There's a reason for it, and it isn't. It has nothing to do with the greed of the restaurateur. Right now, they're barely getting by. Um, yeah,
One area that I'm intrigued by is your work with developers
yeah,
that are looking to add some kind of food component to the development. Could you give us a few examples of that? What would that be? Would a big apartment building or a mall or an airport, or what sorts of developers are you working with? Could you walk us through a couple case examples.
sure. So I'm working with a few at the moment. One is it's an overseas developer that is planning it's a very, very large scale development of essentially a planned city, and they're looking for concepts that are not homegrown. It's food concepts that are both fine dining and fast casual, that can be exported and replicated there, and the sorts of things that um, they're looking for um, are things in the plant-based space, in the ethnic space, and there seems to be a strong interest in nostalgic or sort of pseudo nostalgic Americana. And so, what I've been asked to do is identify um, brands. They could be standalone or multi-unit, that the essence of that brand could then be essentially bottled and taken overseas and then recreated there. But there's a lot of work that happens between the identification of the brand and opening the doors because you need to often adapt the menu and the workflow and the space and the staffing to the idiosyncrasies and the limitations of your host country. So that's one example. Um, Another is I was recently contacted by a boutique hotel in New York City, and they're looking to add a food component. And they're looking for an operator, which I'm not, but I'm going to put them together with an operator. But the interim step is to um, conceptualize an experience that makes sense for the space and for the clientele, and that includes, you know, whether if they're business or leisure travelers, whether it's sort of mid-price or boutique, sort of high price, what the competitive environment is in the neighborhood, of what other restaurants that are out there, what is sort of unique and interesting that can help market the hotel, as well as thinking about a room service component and a menu that can be adapted easily enough to to the guest who shows up at 11 o'clock because their flight is late and they just want a cheeseburger or something close enough to that. So we're in early stages on that project, but I'm looking forward to it because I think there's a lot of moving parts, but it could be a lot of fun.
Yeah, say more about that kind of multiple choice options for of designing an experience at a boutique hotel. Maybe you could give us sort of some examples of what a final outcome might be from either real life or potential answers to that whole question of where you might land. Like
I think, I mean, candidly, this is somewhat new to me, but so I'm drawing from personal experience that's informing how I'm working with this client. But what historically uh, hotel food has been viewed as um, sort of as a second tier experience. The hotel is required to have a restaurant because its guests need it. It's not. It's not given sort of first priority, and it's almost like a little bit of a stepchild in the industry where um, really ambitious chefs don't want to go to a hotel because it feels like a step down. It's almost roughly analogous, sort of pulling from my former career of, movie stars don't work in television. Um, and we know that that's changed, and this is in certainly in the process, or has already changed in the world of hotels. Hotels are This goes back to Ian Schrager and Steve Rubell in the 80s and 90s, making hotels destinations and social and cultural meeting places, and making them sort of hip places that people wanted to be. And so there isn't any there there shouldn't be any disparity towards a hotel restaurant. And I think you're able to attract really talented chefs to do really interesting things. And being in a hotel isn't there's no disadvantage to it. And so we're taking that approach. Is let's look at this almost as the anchor tenant, as being a destination restaurant, not just for the guests of the hotel or for the neighborhood, but for the city at large. And that this is a place that a serious reviewer would consider, and that is in the contention for the same accolades as any other restaurant. So that's component one, and then you have the practical concerns of, you know, people who are staying at the hotel need to have breakfast before they go to their meetings or before they go to the airport. Um, People want to have food in their room. So a room service component is necessary, but can be tricky to weave into a fine dining experience. And then you have all sorts of um, other support services that you may need to provide, grab and go, and things like
What are some things that are tricky about room service, for a hotel?
that. The hours, for one. I mean, you're basically needing to, you're needing to, depending on how you run the business, um, be able to be on demand for customers, in some cases 24 hours a day. And you need to staff accordingly. You need to have a menu um, that is functional that way. That what's called when you fire something, it's restaurant lingo for from the time that it's ordered to the time that it's cooked or prepared or put on the plate, delivered, um, and and you want to think very carefully about that that operational flow from the time that that customer calls in the order. How many ingredients are there? How long does it take to prepare them? How long does it take to plate it? Does it look appetizing? Then it has to be delivered to the room. Does it degrade during that time? Um, and so there's a lot of factors built into that, and that's part of the reason why room service menus are so simple often, because you don't want to have 20 dishes to choose from, and you don't want to have food go to waste, and you also don't you need to have the person that's on at 2 a.m. Be able to make the dish as well as the person that's on at 6 p.m. And so it's often dumbed down, and there's efforts to make things a little more interesting, to add more flavor, to add a little more complexity, but by and large, you want to keep those things fairly simple. And another thing, going back to our earlier conversation about menus, is that um, too much choice actually can work against you, in that there's the guest can get overwhelmed. This has been empirically proven that the more choice you give beyond a certain point becomes paralyzing, and people don't know what to decide, and they don't know what to choose, so they don't choose anything. Um, and
I've
so
heard there's optimal number. Is it like 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or something in that order? That sort of the
again, I think it depends, but that sounds about right. Um, and again, that I draw from my experience in television, that there was this move for in before streaming, that more channels meant more choice, and that was a better experience for viewers. But what happened was that, and it was proven over and over and over again, that um, we went from 40 channels to 80 channels to 200 to 500, but the actual number of channels that people watched, in terms of their sort of heavy rotation, maybe would increase by one or two, and never really got beyond 13 or 14. Um, and so, giving people 8 desserts to choose from is not really, it's doing them a disservice. Um, and so you want to hit certain flavor notes and certain sort of sensory buttons of, you try to make sure you have something that's chocolate, have something that's kind of decadent, have something that's kind of fruity and fresh, but but and always sort of staying within the the um, the mission of the chef, but you don't want to create more than you need to.
fantastic. Stan, if listeners wanted to follow up with you or find more about your work and your firm, where would you point them online?
I would point them to, believe it or not, my general email address. I'm in the midst of launching a new one, but it isn't ready yet. So it's just ssagner@gmail.com.
And great, we'll include that in the show notes.
Sure.
Stan, it was fascinating having this dive through restaurants and food development. And thanks so much for joining today.
Oh, it was my pleasure.